Every great title comes with great responsibility. Kadinche, Your Majesty, and Namita for that very intriguing session. Our next session brings us to a conversation of gods and men. Novelist Amish Tripathi is the writer of the bestseller, The Mortals of Meluha, the first of 3 books of the Shiva trilogy. Amish discusses writing the trilogy to anthropologist, teacher, occasional writer, and reader, Dolma Chodenroder. May you please invite them on stage.
Yeah, it's on. Where is the step? Hi, Your Majesty.
I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Mr. Amish Tripathi, a self-described boring banker termed happy author. Amish worked for 14 years in the finance sector before the publication of his best-selling first book, The Immortals of Meluha, which is on sale at the GSB bookstand in 2010. The book became the first...
They're selling it here, they aren't giving it free?
No, you have to purchase the copy.
Hey, Mountain Echo is very disappointing.
But it's very, it's worth the price, definitely. It's a bargain. The book became the first in what is now known as the Shiva trilogy, in which Amish creatively reimagined the mythology around the Hindu god Shiva, asking, what if Shiva was a real live historical figure? The Shiva trilogy has gone on to become the fastest selling book series in the history of Indian publishing, with 1.7 million copies in print. And last night at the dinner at the Indian Embassy, I saw evidence of that because we were stopped every 5 minutes for photographs. While Amish's compelling, fast-paced storytelling is a huge reason for the success of the trilogy, Amish, with the help of his friends and family, launched a hugely successful and very innovative marketing plan for the books that included social media, video trailers, and hooking the reader by giving them the first chapter for free. Amish has been repeatedly commended not only for writing gripping page turners, but also for changing the very landscape of the Indian publishing industry. And I thought maybe we could start having you read a little extract from the first book, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah. Okay, that was a slightly embarrassing introduction. I'm going to read from the first book. That's for those of you who don't have telescopic vision. This is page 342. It's just to give you a bit of background on this. As she said, the book is based on a fundamental premise that what if we believe that our god Lord Shiva was a real historical man who came to India from Tibet. Came to the land that the area that in the modern world we call the Indus Valley civilization. The locals of that time called it Meluha. And he, in the first book, he leads the Meluhans again in a war against their sworn enemies, the Swadipans. The Meluhans live in the area of what is the Indus Valley civilization, and the Swadipans lived in the area of modern UP, Bihar, Bengal, Bangladesh. And they believed that the Swadipans were evil. The Swadipan rulers were Chandravanshis, Meluhan rulers were Suryavanshis. So Shiva is just about to give a war speech just before the battle, where he is leading the Suryavanshis against the Chandravanshis, the Meluhans against the Swadipans. And this is also based on an interpretation of the war cry of all Shaivites, Har Har Mahadev. So this is how it starts. This is Shiva giving the speech. Shiva vaulted onto his horse in one smooth arc. Holding the baton high, he rode up and down the line. The Suryavanshi roar got louder and louder. Mahadev, Mahadev, Mahadev. Suryavanshis, bellowed Shiva, raising his hand. Meluhans, hear me. The army quietened down to hear the living God. Who is a Mahadev? Roared Shiva. They listened in rapt attention, hanging on his every word. Does he sit on a sad height and look on idly while ordinary men do what should be his job? No. Some soldiers were praying inaudibly. Does he just lazily bestow his blessings while others fight for the good? Does he stand by nonchalantly and count the dead while the living sacrifice themselves to destroy evil? No. A man becomes a Mahadev only when he fights for good. A Mahadev is not born from his mother's womb. He is forged in the heat of battle when he wages a war to destroy evil. The army stood hushed, feeling a flood of positive energy. I am a Mahadev, bellowed Shiva. A resounding roar arose from the Suryavanshis. They were led by the Mahadev, the god of gods. The Chandravanshis did not stand a chance. But I am not the only one. A shocked silence descended on the Suryavanshis. What did the Mahadev mean? He's not the only one? Do the Chandravanshis have a god too? I am not the only one, for I see 100,000 Mahadevs in front of me. I see 100,000 men willing to fight on the side of good. I see 100,000 men willing to battle evil. I see 100,000 men capable of destroying evil. The stunned Suryavanshis gaped at their Nilkanth as the import of his words permeated their minds. They dared not ask the question, are we gods? Shiva had the answer. Har ek hai Mahadev. The Meluhans stood astounded. Every single one a Mahadev? Har Har Mahadev, bellowed Shiva. The Meluhans roared. All of us are Mahadevs. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Of course, the first question that anyone would ask is, how did you decide to retell the story of Shiva, which is a very familiar one to many people? How did you come upon this idea to come up?
With due apologies to Shakespeare, there are few people who achieve good ideas through hard work. There are few people who are born with good ideas, and there are few who have good ideas thrust upon them. And I am from that last group. I never even wanted to be an author, frankly. I was a complete left-brain guy all through school, college, and my working life. I'm a maths geek. I graduated in mathematics, did an MBA, and worked in financial services for 14 years. Whatever you may hear, it's a very exciting world, okay? Banking, it's really exciting. So my entire life was spent in that area. My last job was in an insurance company, and there's a very famous American film director who said that there are things worse than death. Have you ever spent an evening with an insurance guy? So I was that kind of guy. So I am as stunned as anyone else, including my family, that I've actually written something and forget about it being received well. Because I didn't even want to be a writer. I had written no fiction ever before The Immortals of Meluha, not even a short story in school, absolutely nothing. I was an academically oriented guy and yes, a bit of a sports enthusiast, boxing, gymnastics, but never was I creative, ever. So in my mind, there's only one logical explanation. I don't care how strange it sounds, that it's a blessing of Lord Shiva, because I can't explain where the story comes from. It started as a pure philosophical thesis 9-10 years ago, which got converted into an adventure, into a story to convey those philosophies. And as the only way I can explain it is, look, I just open the laptop and it's almost like there's a parallel universe, and I have been given the privilege of entering that universe and just recording what I see. So I see it as a real life movie. I feel the emotions of the characters, I laugh with them, I cry with them, and I just describe what I see. So the idea was thrust upon me. It didn't, I can't say that I achieved it.
The other thing I was really struck, it's very interesting that you brought up the very visual nature of your book, because it uses very visual sort of language, and as a reader, it was very easy to imagine some of these scenes, particularly the battle scenes. And I read that you've sold the film rights for the book. And I wondered how you felt as the creator of this world or this parallel universe, how you felt about someone else now reimagining your reimagining, and how much creative control you wanted or were willing to give up as it's converted into a film.
The bad news for my publisher usually is I'm a control freak. Okay, so I like to decide every single aspect of my book. I'm involved in everything, and I irritate the hell out of them. As far as my book is concerned, yes, that's the way I work. But one has to realize one thing, that every project needs a captain. Democracy is a great way to run a country. It's not a good way to run private enterprise or any project, because you usually have chaos. And if you have confusion over who the captain is, that's when you have chaos. In a book, the captain must be the author. And the final decision maker must be the author, regardless of what the editor thinks, what the publisher thinks, what the critics think, or frankly, what even the readers think. The decision maker can only be the author. But in a movie, the decision maker has to be the director. It cannot be the scriptwriter or the producer or anyone else. Otherwise, you have chaos. So which means that, as you know, thinking pragmatically as an author, I have to find someone whom I trust, and then I have to go ahead and trust that guy. Now, will he have to make some changes to the book to adapt it into a movie? Of course, yes. It's a different medium. In a book, it's driven by words, and each reader has his own imagination of the story. Even if you have the same description of Lord Shiva, I'm sure every person out here will have a different interpretation of that same description. Whereas in a movie, the viewer doesn't have the freedom of his own interpretation. He only watches one interpretation, the director's interpretation. So the director obviously has to adapt it a little bit. There's the problem of length as well. My books are relatively long. They're around 400 pages. The last one is around 600 pages. Rough rule of thumb, from what I've been told, is 1 page on the manuscript converts into 1 minute on screen. So my books, if they made it word to word, it would be a 7-hour-long movie, which is a human rights violation. So obviously they will have to adapt the book a little bit, to make it, to make it palatable, or to make it fit onto a screen. And that adaptation one has to accept. As long as they keep the soul of the book, then there shouldn't be a problem. And there are movies which have really captured the soul of a book. Look at, on the Indian side, look at the various Devdas adaptations, Sarachand's classic. Look at Parinita. On the Western side, look at Gone with the Wind, To Kill a Mockingbird. Even the recent Life of Pi. It's not exactly like the book, but they have certainly captured the soul of the book, and they're both independently good in their own right. So Karan had told me when he'd met me that we will make a movie that is worthy of Lord Shiva, and inshallah we will.
That's fabulous. One of the things that I really enjoyed about the book was that you've written very strong women characters. I mean, the women in your books are warriors, they're doctors, they're leaders, and I wondered if you would talk a little bit about this. Was this deliberate? Why did you decide that it was important to have women portrayed this way?
I think part deliberate. Come, Moon. You can just sit in out here. Hi. I think part deliberate, part what I see as a normal way of life. I have the good fortune of being surrounded by a lot of very strong women. My wife, my sister, my mother, my sisters-in-law, they don't take shit from anyone. And that is the atmosphere in which I grew up. My mother was very clear that the rules that applied to us three boys, to my sister, she's the eldest, would apply to us three boys as well. And we grew up in that atmosphere. So seeing strong women for me is a natural, way of life. But it's not just that. There is a deliberate attempt out here as well. I think that the biggest social issue by far, facing India, and frankly many countries around the world, is women's empowerment. Across all religious groups, across all linguistic communities, across all caste groups, across all social classes, by far the most oppressed group are women in India. And I genuinely believe that we cannot become the great country that we are capable of becoming till we solve this fundamental issue. And this issue has to be more important than any other issue. Religious divides, caste divides, social divides, none of them matter as much as this particular issue. And you go to countries where women are more empowered, and you find usually they are better run countries. And countries which have made dramatic improvements in their social indicators. Look at Bangladesh, one of my favorite examples. It's a country that we in India sadly don't look at. I wish we would focus on them a lot more. They have achieved tremendous social indicator improvements in the last 30 years in terms of literacy, female literacy, child mortality, mortality of women at the time of pregnancy or birth. In the last 30 years. I'd read a World Bank report which said that the social indicator improvements in Bangladesh have been amongst the fastest in human history, almost as fast as the Meiji Restoration era Japan, which is the gold standard in social indicator improvements. And it has been driven by women's empowerment. The NGOs, the government have focused all their efforts on the women. And this is the key, this is the secret. And we in India must take this seriously. So I feel very, very passionately about this issue. And in my own small way, I try and put that thought across in my books. We must focus on women's empowerment.
It's definitely clear in the books because all the women are completely capable and there's no question of their ability to perform whatever profession they've been given. I just want to make, okay. So sorry. Is this, okay, sorry, it's working. So you've been quoted as saying, it's a fallacy to think that a good book sells itself. I can give you a long list of books that I think should have been bestsellers, but nobody's heard of. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the marketing and distributing campaign that you did for your books and how you came up with the ideas. I mean, they're quite unusual, and now I think much copied. And maybe if you had a little bit of advice for aspiring Bhutanese authors who'd like their books to find audiences in the same way.
Thank you. Yes, I do believe that. I'm a voracious reader. And seriously, I can give you a long list of books which should have been massive bestsellers, but they have not been marketed well. And in the Indian publishing industry, there's a very childish and immature approach towards marketing, where it's thought that it's not important. And I find this childish. It's considered infra-dig. Now, if an author of the class of Charles Dickens, who's probably one of the finest authors of the last 200 years, he's also a little known fact is he was a fantastic marketer, right? Many of the first innovative ideas of marketing actually came from Charles Dickens. And if he could go around marketing his books, then practically every single author today, none of whom can hold a candle to Charles Dickens, even they can frankly go around marketing their books. And it is crucial. You have to market it. If you don't market a book, how will anyone hear of it? If you haven't heard of it, how will you buy it? If you haven't bought it, how will you read it? And I will tell you how. Who said that? Good question. The point is each book has to have its, when you're writing the book, you cannot be thinking about the market. The book has to be written with the honesty of your heart, right? And you cannot change the book to appeal to a market because trust me, that doesn't work. But once you finish the book, then you need to be a pragmatic guy and figure out, okay, how do I position this? How do I sell this? And you have to decide that and you have, like any good marketing campaign, you have to answer a few questions. That what is my target audience? Okay, who are the guys who will probably like this book? Okay, why will they like it? Right, and how do I get to them? Right, these are three simple questions which usually don't get spoken of because I've noticed in publishing companies, a marketing plan means we've designed a poster. That's not really a marketing plan. You have to think this through and you have to make, in all professional companies, you make a standard marketing document, marketing strategy document. You have to make that and then your thoughts become clear. So for example, in my book, some of the ideas that emerged were from this basis that, okay, what is the target market we want to get? What are the problems that we have in reaching out to them and what should the messaging be to them? So what are the fundamental problems that I had in my first book? My book was rejected by every single publisher it was sent to. It was quasi self-published, with my agent. He invested in the printing, I invested in the marketing. And they said it's a religious book, and the youth aren't interested in religion. That was the primary reason. So they said there's no hope of it selling. So which meant that I didn't have the backing of a big publisher to get me display space in a retail store, right? So my first target audience were people who are walking into retail stores. Now they need to know that my book has been launched. Usually if you're a debut author, even of a big publisher, your books are usually a well-kept secret. Not just from the readers, even from the store staff. Even they don't know your book has been launched. Okay, it usually lies somewhere in the 7th, 8th row, or maybe just packed in the warehouse. Okay, and gets returned 6 months later. So how do you get the store staff and the readers to know that your book has been launched? This is where an idea emerged. This idea came from my wife. She's the smart one in the family. And the idea was that can we actually distribute the first chapter free of cost? It's a bit like a sampler, right? And we can ask people to check out the sampler, and if they like it, come back and buy the book, right? I made PowerPoint presentations with all these details, and I went to various chain stores, and presented the idea to them. And we said, look, we're printing it, and with the same cover as the main book, and we're giving it to you free of cost. All you have to do is distribute it. I didn't think, perhaps because the idea had never been tried before, the retailers didn't realize the implication of what they were agreeing to. They were giving me display space free of cost, but they didn't realize it. So my free booklets were displayed at the cash counter, which, if you think about it, is prime display space, okay? Because customers come, he's waiting to buy his book, he's waiting for his bill, he has absolutely nothing to do. He sees a booklet out there with an interesting looking cover, saying free of cost, and okay, so let's pick it up, and that worked for us. A lot of people just picked that up as a sampler, and they came back and asked, okay, now where's the book? And we launched this sampler 10 days before the main book. And what happened was the traffic back to ask for the main book was so high that the chain stores actually increased their order even before the book was launched, with the result that the book hit the bestseller charts within the first week of its launch. So this idea really worked well for us. What happened was, since it was at the cash counter, most readers actually go and ask at the cash counter. Readers do take recommendations. All right, so they either ask store staff or they go to the cash counter. And the rule of any sales guy is he doesn't want to look stupid in front of his customer. So he'll speak of a book that he's heard of or he knows something about. Now the store staff which was sitting out there had nothing to do, sees this free booklet, they pick it up, they read the back, and they know what it's about. So if a customer comes and asks, they say, hey, this is a nice book, do you want to try it out, right? So recommendations also picked up, okay, for us. So this idea really worked well for us. The second idea that worked well for us was, this was an idea from a friend of mine, Abhijit Wadwal. He read the manuscript and he said that your book has a very visual feel. And can we communicate this through marketing? So he said, can we actually make a proper live action trailer film? And again, this is something that had never been tried before. And one of the benefits that of not being backed by any big publisher, that we didn't have any industry insiders. And it's true of any industry, good ideas usually come from people outside the industry, because they don't have any blinkers on, they don't have an attitude of, "Arey, 100 saal mein humne kabhi aisa idea try nahi kiya hai." That's the most irritating line, that anyone can give to me, that we never tried this before. So what? I mean, try it now. But we didn't have people like that in our team. So we said, why not? Let's try a trailer film. Okay. Now remember, I was investing my own money. I don't come from a wealthy background. I don't have daddy's money to freak out on. So I was investing my own salary, right? Part of my savings. And despite what you guys think, bankers don't make that much money. Okay. So so I had a bit of savings to invest. So we had to do the best that we could from that small budget. But I clearly wanted a live action trailer film. I didn't want animation, though that would be cheaper, because animation would cue fantasy. And I wanted people to know that this is about Lord Shiva as a real man, which is why even on the cover, though it was more expensive, we actually shot. It's not graphic. It's actually a shot of a man, and in the backdrop is the actual Kailash mountain, this and the Mansarovar lake. Even on the spine, there's the ancient Pashupati seal. This is the earliest ever discovered symbol of Lord Shiva. Even on this, I didn't want a line drawing because that would look unreal. So we actually made a clay model of this and we shot it and we put it out here. So I wanted it to cue reality. So which is why we wanted a live action trailer film, not an animation. So, we had music made by Tawfiq Qureshi ji, and he did it at a very low cost, because of, we approached him through a friend. And he thought, okay, this guy is some random guy who's trying something, let's help him out. We shot against a green chroma with one model, and the rest of it was all special effects. And we put this up on YouTube, and that garnered a lakh and a half views very quickly. and which really drove the book sale again. So I think if you ask me honestly, these two ideas really worked well for us. Marketing is not about the money, it's about high quality ideas. That's what usually works. I cannot lay claim to the ideas because the ideas came from others. I guess the only skill I can claim is that I had the ability to pick a good idea, but the ideas aren't mine.
And actually, I've watched the trailers online. It's very easy to find on YouTube. What's really interesting is that even though it's live action, you're very careful not to show the face. So it's easy for the audience to imagine.
Even on the covers of the book,
yes,
that was one of the guidelines. There's a lot of symbolism on the book as well. There's Indus Valley script symbols across the cover of the book. We never want to show the face because we wanted people to let their imagination run with it. There's a color theme through the book. It's blue. The second one the theme is green. The third one is red. That's RGB. That's the additive color system. There are two ways to create artificial colors: additive color system, subtractive color system. Additive works from black to white, which symbolically means movement from evil to good. So that's the logic of the symbol of the three colors. So there's a lot of thought that has gone into the cover as well, which, see, you have to do marketing in such a way that you can appeal to people at a surface level where it looks good, and there are a few aficionados, okay, who want to go deeper, who want to see symbolism. People who have read the Vedas, who've read the Upanishads, who've read the Puranas, and they can make out the clues. Yes. Now those guys want to find something deeper because that's what makes them more passionate. And that of course works at an interaction level because you love interacting with them as an author. It also works at a marketing level because your most passionate marketers are those book aficionados who found symbols in there and love those symbols, and then they go and passionately talk to another 100 people that buy this damn book, you know. So you have to have that symbolism in there as well. You know, the section breaks, for example, in the
book is all
yeah, and I purposely not clarified this anywhere, but the aficionados write to me on Facebook or Twitter, and they ask me what it means, or they figure it out by themselves. Yeah. There are section breaks within the book. For those without telescopic vision, there's actually Indus Valley script, and it's an undeciphered script, but I have my own interpretation of that script. I'm not saying it's an official script, it's my interpretation, and in that interpretation, this is how Shiva would be written. Okay. Now this is something only the aficionados will bother to find out, and that's what will make them even more passionate. So you might put this in, but there's no need to clarify it. Yeah, so you have to appeal to the aficionados, like the journey of finding that answer, and there are people, of course, who just read it at a surface story level and enjoy that as well.
One of the other things that I read that I thought was really interesting, considering that when you first tried to publish your book, it was dismissed as too religious, is that when you started to write the book, you were not very religious. You were, in fact, an atheist, and that you've said that the process of writing the book has made you feel more devoted to Shiva. I wondered if you could talk about that journey a little bit.
I should clarify that I was born into a very religious family. So I was religious when I was young. My grandfather was a Pandit in Banaras and a teacher at BHU. He was the head of the mathematics department. He'd done a master's in maths. He'd also done a master's in Sanskrit. And he was one of those rare people who couldn't just understand classical Sanskrit, but understand Vedic Sanskrit as well. I'm sure all of you are aware the Sanskrit that's alive today is classical Sanskrit based on Panini's Astadhyayi. The original Sanskrit, which our ancestors spoke, was Vedic Sanskrit, which sadly very few people know today. So my grandfather was deeply devoted to our scriptures, and he was also a very liberal guy, which in traditional India is not a contradiction. So I guess that atmosphere, kind of spread out in the entire family. So both my parents are also very religious and very liberal. So we didn't learn any nonsense like one religion is better than another religion. But in our growing up years, we would discuss parts of the Vedas, of the Upanishads, of the Puranas, and we would interpret. And since it was a liberal family, we were encouraged again and again that you must ask questions, because only when you ask questions can you understand something deeply. And my father used to keep quoting this lovely couplet from the Bhagavad Gita to me, from the 18th Adhyay, from the 18th chapter, where, so I'm sure all of you are aware that Bhagavad Gita is actually an allegory. Lord Krishna is not talking to Arjun, he's actually speaking to us through Arjun. And in this couplet, Lord Krishna tells Arjun that I have given you knowledge most profound. Now your task is to think about it and then do what you think is right? Which means even Lord Krishna is telling us you're supposed to use your own goddamn mind. right? Because if you weren't supposed to use your brain, I wouldn't have given it to you. And my father used to keep telling all of us this thing, that if something doesn't make sense to you, question, because that's the only way you can understand. So I grew up in that atmosphere. It was a good fortune of birth. That's how I know much of what I know of mythology, of our scriptures. Excuse me. But I did turn into an atheist, yes, in the early 90s. Some of you may be too young to remember, but the city that I lived in, Mumbai, we went through a series of communal riots and bomb blasts. We had a big gang in Xavier's College at that point of time. There were 20 of us. Is the time running out? Oh, okay. Okay. There were around 20 of us. Majority of us were Hindus. It's a reflection of the country. But we had Muslims, Christians, Parsis. My wife is half Parsi. And she was in my gang, obviously. She was my girlfriend at that time. And there were 20 of us. And I think all of us, we started blaming religion for these fights. And we just turned against religion. And my father used to try to explain to me that there are religious extremists. Fortunately in India, they're a very small minority. But you cannot blame religion for what the religious extremists do. And if there are religious extremists, then it's the duty of the religious liberals to speak even more loudly. Because if we don't do that, we allow hatred to be spread. We allow the religious extremists to insult our religion with the nonsense that they spread. But I was a teenager. I didn't really understand that. So I turned into an atheist. And there were times when I was agnostic, when I didn't care either way. There were times when I would be an extreme atheist, phases. And in those phases, I would refuse to enter temples. My wife, that time she was my girlfriend, and she's very religious. So I would, walk up to the temple gates with her, and I would wait outside till in my atheist phases, where she would go in. I don't know what the hell I was trying to prove, but I would wait outside. I would refuse to enter. I'd become that extremist. And writing the book kind of brought me back to faith. So I think the correct thing would be to say it's not that I discovered faith, I rediscovered faith. And I understand today what my father used to tell me, that we religious liberals have a duty. If we keep quiet, we allow the religious extremists and the secular extremists to win the argument. And both those groups are idiots. Okay? And we religious liberals have to speak loudly. For the good of our country, for the good of our religion. We have to speak loudly. Thank you.
I could give me a chance to applaud. I could go on asking you questions, but Meetha's pointed out we only have 10 minutes, and I'm 5 now. Maybe we have time for one question from the audience. Should I pass the mic back, or how should we do? You have it? Okay.
If I can't answer, and then I'll be sure I'll hang around outside.
Yes, sir.
May I just... sorry. Somebody else?
You stand and ask. You can't sit in.
The Shiva trilogy. I don't think enough people in India, me for instance, truly understand what the relationship between Shiva and all the other gods is. He's considered to be the top honcho. But I don't think everybody understands that. Now what I see is the great reinterpretation of many of our myths and legends and gods from a psychological point of view. Would you like to comment on that a little bit?
Good question. I'm guessing you're a Shaivite. And okay, as am I. Man, you really fell in love with Bhutan, didn't you? No, well, my wife is a practicing Buddhist too, if that helps. Yes, there are Shaivite. In the Indian concept of God, there is the Nirgun Nirakar concept of God, which is at the highest, which is kind of similar to the Semitic concept of God, but not exactly, because this Nirgun Nirakar concept of God does not have any likes or dislikes, never picks sides. He is for everyone, right? There is that concept. There is an Akar concept of God where God has taken a form, okay, like Lord Vishnu, Lord Shiva, Lord Brahma, Shaktima. There's the avatar concept of God, or as I always joke, the Americans go avatar concept of God, where God takes a human form, does his karma, dies and goes back. And there's the fourth concept of God where a man becomes a God, like Gautam Buddha. Many Hindus, including me, many Buddhists in India, believe that he was a God. Now, there are Shaivites who believe that the Nirgun Nirakar concept, Nirgun Nirakar God was also Shiva. There are Vaishnavas who believe that the Nirgun Nirakar God was also Vishnu. There are Krishna Bhaks who believe that Nirgun Nirakar God was Krishna. If you go to the Purans, the Nirgun Nirakar God is called Paramatma. If you go to the Vedas, he's called Ekam. Okay, the famous Nasadeo hymn, for example, which is, and if you truly want to understand the Indian way of life, the Hindu way of life, you have to understand this hymn in the Rig Veda called the Nasadeo. Many people, kind of follow that way of life, the questioning way of life that most of us Indians have, without even having heard of the Nasadeo. That really is one of our core hymns. Nasadeo refers to the Nirgun Nirakar God as Ekam, the one. Okay, so there are various names for that Nirgun Nirakar God. Now, which is the truth? Is Shiva the Nirgun Nirakar God? Is Vishnu the Nirgun Nirakar God? Let me answer this through, let me give two answers for this. One, there's this lovely line in the Rig Veda from the Asya Vamasya hymn. It says, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. Truth is one, but the wise men know it as many. Right? And this is a wonderful thought to understand, that I might have my interpretation that Shiva is the Nirgun Nirakar God. A Vaishnav may have his interpretation that Vishnu is the Nirgun Nirakar God. A Muslim may have his interpretation that Allah is the Nirgun Nirakar God. All of us are right from our own perspective. We have our own paths. The destination may be the same, but our paths may be different. We don't need to judge another man's path. He has a right to his truth, I have a right to my truth. This is one answer. The second answer is actually from the Puranas. If you read all the Shaivite Purans, they usually have the 1,000 names of Shiva, or the 1,008 names, depending on which Puran you read, names of Shiva listed out there. If you read it in the Shiv Puran, one of the names listed for Lord Shiva in there is Vishnu. Right? If you have read the Vishnu Sahasranam, any Vishnu will, any Vaishnav will know that hymn. In Ekadashi or in important days for Lord Vishnu, you recite the Vishnu Sahasranam, which is the 1,000 names of Vishnu. One of the names listed for Lord Vishnu in the Vishnu Sahasranam is Shiva. They are both one and the same. So I think that was the concept of the list of the names in the Shiv Puran and the Vishnu Sahasranam. So getting into this debate of who is the supreme God is, in my mind, as childish as a school fight of my daddy strongest. It's a pointless argument. You have a right to your God, your path to God. I have a right to my path to God. There's no need for anyone to judge the other. That's the way I see it. Sorry, the mics have been killed.
I'm so sorry, but it looks like we're up against the tea break. But the very nice thing,
very small question.
I don't know if they'll allow it.
Over to
I
you.
think the very nice thing about being at a small, intimate literary festival is you can accost him at lunch, at tea, at lunch, to sign the books you're going to buy.
You don't want to take her on, okay? So
but I'm sure
stepping off.
Yeah, there's many more questions, but thank you so much. This is wonderful.
Thank you so much.